So, who are you and what do you do?
I am Mike Norton. I'm a professor at Harvard Business School and the author of The Ritual Effect.
Brand new book. Mike, congratulations.
Thank you. It's been exciting.
You have to be crazy to release a business book in these hostile times, is what I think at this point.
Well, when you hear The Ritual Effect, nobody thinks that sounds like a business book. So I'm a little safer. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's true that it probably is more business nonfiction, but I'm guessing because of the nature of the title and how it's being positioned, you're probably falling into the whole self-help world as well, I'm guessing.
We get a little bit of both. Yeah. I think it's funny. It's good and bad that rituals occur everywhere in life. So you can write a book about all of human life, or you could say, let's look at rituals in this domain or that domain. I went broad because I have no attention span. So I decided to do it in business and also in life.
So I do want to talk about the book, but I would be remiss if we didn't spend a couple minutes just talking about life on campus. You were at MIT, now at Harvard. These are hot and crazy times, from encampments to this emerging idea that I think is awakening a lot of people in terms of wokeism and what's been happening. How are you dealing with it? You're in a different part of the school, I'm sure. And I'm assuming people in the business school are more interested in the capitalistic, democracy driven models because they want to move forward in life. But it seems like a really strange time where many people are even questioning, what are these universities? What's happening there? How have you been dealing with it? And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that as with any as with any family or any organization, just a wide variety of viewpoints among people who work at Harvard and obviously among students who go to Harvard. And I think we're seeing it all over the country now that, different people are having lots of very strong views. So we, as academics, I think we try to think about understanding, in a sense, what's going on. We all have our own beliefs, of course, but there is this sense of trying to, an historian would look back and study the 1970s and say, what was actually happening. And I think some academics are trying to do that, really understand what's going on, why these emotions are so strong right now.
But do you see it? I'm curious about the business school in particular. When I think about Harvard Business School, it's you get the goosebumps of that's where case studies are studied, excitement, people on campus, and you have this group of young people who are hopeful taking these courses because they want to go into the business world. Are you seeing a new type of philosophy or attitude about? We talked about social business for many, many decades, but it feels like there's almost an extreme version of that or a different perception of it. Or do you find that these students are almost like the students before?
You got garbled a little bit there, but I think you were the current students.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just start
Yeah.
from there answering. I think it worked on my side. Like, I think there's probably a connection thing, but it'll come together.
Yeah. Great. Okay. A confession I have to make is that I haven't taught MBA students in quite a few years.
Okay.
So I've been teaching different things across the school. And so I'm not the best finger on the pulse faculty member to kind of understand the current crop of MBA students. Others, I think, are interacting with them much more.
Cool. So let's talk about the book. One of the first things that struck me in reading The Ritual Effect was probably my own personal grappling with the transition point of habits into rituals, or what the difference is. Is a ritual simply a habit we think more deeply about? I grappled with this. You do a good job of defining it, but I'm sure when people come into this conversation, their first reaction will be them self inventorying their lives and wondering, well, what's a habit and what's a ritual after all?
In fact, when I interact with people, they'll tell me about something they do. And then they'll say, as though I'm the,
Yeah.
guru.
Is
Can
washing
you
my car a ritual or a
exactly,
habit? Yeah.
exactly. Can you bless it either as a ritual or as a habit? And of course, some people want it to be a habit. Some people want it to be a ritual. So it's actually quite interesting to think where we come down on how we like to code things in our lives. For me, I think, by the way, I'm pro habits. I think we should all have good habits, exercise, eat right. So I never mean to say habits are bad. In fact, some of the research that I do is trying to help people have better habits. So I'm totally on board with good habits, but I think that they can be a little kind of dry and mechanistic. And when I think about, imagine starting today for the rest of your life, you had perfect habits, never deviated from anything. I think after 40 years, you'd say that wasn't that interesting. that wasn't that emotional. That wasn't that rich. And I think one of the things that rituals do is they pull us from the mundane. I mean, we have this phrase going through the motions, literally, which is just the mundanity of everyday life. Rituals can pull us a little bit away from that towards something that has more meaning or more emotion, even just more joy.
So, exercise, some people might see it as some type of ritual, or would you say no? It's some type of component in the exercise that would make it ritualistic. This is where I get into, maybe it's too much minutia, but I do think it's important to understand, because a lot of the things that I do habitually, I might think are ritualistic. I'll give you a great example. Morning coffee. I would argue that this isn't a habit so much as some type of ritual that gets me from kids dropping off home life into how I'm preparing for my workday.
I think that's right. I mean, if you think about running or morning coffee, it's there's the thing itself. So there's, running is the activity that you're doing. Technically, what you're doing is like caffeinating. You're using liquid to caffeinate. I mean, we just get really, really basic down to the, and it's clearly for many people, it is just that. For some people, coffee, they say, it's just caffeine. I just need to wake up. And other people say, well, I make it with this specific bean every single morning, and I always grind it for this long, and then I steep it for all this kind of stuff with coffee and tea. And it's feeling more like a ritual because it's not just the what, it's how. And as soon as you switch from just what you are doing to caring about how you do it, including like not just running, but how you tie your shoelaces, how you put your shoes on, that gets it toward ritual. Not ritual like people in robes with candles. That's that's further down the road, but just that how things matter, how things happen really starts to matter to you. And one way you can really tell is if it gets interrupted or if you can't do it in the way you usually do. Some people say that's fine. And that's like a habit. They don't really care. They need to drink coffee. And other people, if they get interrupted, for example, their kid comes in, they say things like, I feel off. I don't feel ready. I wasn't ready to start the day. I felt weird all day. That kind of emotion, it's the same thing. We're just drinking liquid in cups. But for some people, it's imbued with much, much more than just that. And that, again, is how it starts to creep toward ritualistic and less just a kind of dry habit.
So, ritualistic is how we internalize it, our psychology of it, how it gives us some type of framework for the future. I'm thinking about, we can simplify and think, well, I'm just reading from a book. No, you're praying. It's very similar, right? We can systematize the action. Is what makes it ritualistic the psychology of it? Is that the only gap?
What's incredibly frustrating about studying rituals, but also for me, it makes it fascinating, is that two people can be engaged in the exact same actions. And for one of them, it is a deeply important ritual. And for the other one, it's literally going through the motion. So I'm Irish Catholic. So if I were to observe a Catholic Mass, everyone who's there is doing things in unison. They're sitting when it's appropriate. They're kneeling when it's appropriate. We all know, whatever our faith is, we all know the way to enact it in a religious service. But for some people in that Catholic Mass, they are expressing their deepest faith in God. They're connecting to previous generations. It's a very powerful experience. And the person right next to them is there because their parents made them go. It doesn't mean anything to them at that point in their life. And the only way I can tell, to your question, the only way I can tell is if I actually ask them, how did that feel to you? Was that emotional? Was that meaningful? Did it mean something to you? And when people tell us, yes, same with coffee. How do you feel about coffee? People say, I just need caffeine. Or they say, well, the bean
Coffee
is from
religion.
Exactly. I got to do it this way. I got to do it that way. That again it's moving it toward this kind of richer experience, I think.
So let's talk about this idea of richer experience, because the other components of the book that I found myself grappling with was my fear that something that may not be, in essence, a ritual becomes a ritual. And by doing that, it potentially replaces things that truly are ritualistic. And by doing so, perhaps we're devaluing the stuff that is more ritualistic. You think about the higher calling, whether it's religion based, whatever these other rituals might be, a marriage even. Some would argue that maybe we've turned marriage into a habit because we're not.
We're getting good at it.
Yeah, but do you
Yeah.
think about that where we're going now to the other side of this, where it's not so much the habit to ritual, but what if things become a ritual that devalues what a ritual actually should be, or the value of ritual to a greater community or family unit?
Yeah, I think that there is, if you look, sociologists in the United States, for example, participation in religious services has declined over the last decades. And on the one hand, that's people can feel differently about religion. Of course, everyone has their own view, but religion does do some positive things for us. Leaving aside even the faith aspect, it gathers us together and gives us social support. So just that alone is enormously valuable function of religion. For other people, it has many more functions as well, and it's deeply meaningful. But let's just even take that aspect of it. That is lost in a sense. If we're no longer gathering to express our faith, we're no longer gathering, and gathering is really good for humans. But what's so fascinating to me is when people stop religion, they usually don't stop ritual. They just
Right.
come up with a new one. They just decide. And my favorite example we ever found was the Seattle Atheist Church. You just gotta
Well, that
let it
sounds like
sink.
something Dan Ariely would do, by the
It's
way.
it's like there's no way, right? I mean, there's no it's like a 30 Rock or something like that. But of course, you know exactly what it is, right? These are people who see, if there's 10 elements of religion, 8 of them are great for them. They don't have the faith part, but they have all these other things that religion can bring. And so they literally gather, and they're atheists, but they gather in a church. They give social support. They gather, they know each other, they talk about their emotions and what they're going through. They even have a special thing you have to hold when it's your turn to speak. I mean, they literally
Like
have
a conch,
recreated
yeah.
things. Exactly. And so there we see it's true for some people, the religious aspect in terms of faith is gone. Yet very often what we do instead is not nothing, but we come up with something brand new. And the coming up with something brand new is actually what was so fascinating to me about rituals, is that we're not just receiving them from family or from religion. We're doing that for sure, but we're also constantly making up our own all the time as groups and as individuals. And that really opened it up to me to say, wow, what are people actually doing and not talking about?
But I guess I'm not sure where you stand or how you think about rituals in the sense of them replacing stuff that is so deeply human and we commoditize it. I'm thinking about we went from fitness to calling it wellness. Wellness opened up this world of yoga and meditation, which gets us very close to religious types of work. You also have, from the community aspect, I'm thinking more specifically about I no longer go to church, but I'm in CrossFit, like that type of
Yeah,
mentality. So we can laugh about it and think it's humorous, but I actually think about the grander scope of humanity and what religions or communities have done in relation to us, again, maybe devaluing it, and that creates like serious problems within society where we don't have these moral compasses or anchors.
I think that we do certainly see when people lose, for example, these affiliations, they do lose aspects of them. I think that if you think of something like Burning Man, for example,
Great example.
it's a group of people who there's not a religious aspect to it in terms of faith. But I mean, if you break it down, it's like literally a pilgrimage to the desert, which sounds very religious, and then you take
Very
substances
communal.
together,
Yeah,
very
and very,
communal.
very communal. Yeah.
You burn a thing at the very end and kind of a ceremony sort of thing. So there again, it's we're moving around what we decide to do as ritual, but we're not
Yeah.
exactly losing it. But I do think another important aspect of these kinds of rituals is that it is true that they can bond us together for sure, but we also see in our research that they can drive us apart, because
Right.
when you have a ritual that you think is good, that's fantastic. But when you think your ritual is right, well, now we have a whole other problem. Even on something, I mean, not to go back to something silly like coffee, but even on coffee, if you have something very specific you need to do with the coffee every morning, that's going to drive your spouse crazy. You know what I mean? Because they're going to say, "Can I just please have some coffee?"
Right.
So even there, when it goes from being, "I like to do this, it makes me feel good," to "it is the correct way," that leads to, therefore, other ways are wrong, and then we start to get conflict. So they have this kind of mixed component to them, I think, where what they for sure do is bring emotion, positive emotions, negative emotions, but it isn't always just kind of more rituals is better for us.
So, what is that balance? I'm curious about the place where rituals become unhealthy. They might do things like amplify someone's OCD or their psychological, wherever they might be in some type of mental health state, that these could actually be perpetuators of more problems if they're validating it by saying, well, it's just a ritual.
We do see in the research on obsessive compulsive disorder, um, typically what people are doing with their ritual is they're doing it in the service of something else. So, for example, you're doing your morning coffee ritual in the service of getting ready for your day and getting ready to host your podcast or whatever it might be. So we're
Well,
often doing
it
them.
could also be, Mike, that I'm trying to drive over the bridge and not off of it too.
For sure. Yeah, I think they
Right.
do. Rituals are often associated with control. But I think one thing in OCD that happens is you lose the link between I'm doing the ritual in order to, and you start to do the ritual in order to do the ritual.
Right.
So
Broken
if you think
record.
about leaving your house in the morning and double checking you locked the door, many people do this. What you're doing is you just want a little check and then you can go to work and feel that your house is safe. So you're doing it in order to. And then what can happen with OCD is you get stuck in a loop of checking in order to check, in order to check. And that's when it starts to move from a quirky thing that we do that offers some value to something where we might say, I don't know the exact line at which, but we might say, if it starts to interfere with your other goals in life, then perhaps the ritualistic behavior has gone too far.
It's hard to believe that we're recording this and we're halfway through 2024. And I believe we had a unique moment in time because of the global pandemic that would actually set some type of precedence for us to look at something like this in a deeper way. And it led me to think about how badly or well might COVID impact some of this thinking. Because it was such a break in our habits and daily routine that the formation of rituals, I don't think is an easy thing. I think the formation of rituals is something that's developed over time, unless it's given to you by a community or by a religion. What do you think about that transition? Because it's easy to look at this at a scale in time, but then suddenly you have a moment where all of our patterns and habits and rituals got so deeply disrupted.
It was, so I signed a contract to write this book in January of 2020.
Perfect timing.
And some things happened after that that really, I think changed the focus of the book in a little bit, in the sense that we had this event that happened that, as you said, disrupted everything. From my perspective, what was in terms of rituals, what was fascinating is people didn't just abandon rituals, they found other ways to do them.
Right.
So if you think in the United States with Thanksgiving, you could just say, you know what, we can't get together this year, let's just skip it. And instead people got on Zoom. Everybody made things at their house. They tried to do a version of Thanksgiving or weddings. People postpone their
Right.
wedding, or they try to do it online and then they do it in person. They come up with these new ways so that the desire's in us and we still want to enact it. And that's when we get really creative. Even something like commuting to work, which was a nice, speaking of you leaving from home to work and
need the
that transition,
yeah.
when you lose the commute that nobody likes commuting, but what it did do was a natural break of time between home self and work self. So what do people do when they work from home? They don't just say, no, I don't need a transition. They come up with the most fascinating things in order to try to separate work from home.
Right.
And one guy he was a cyclist, used to cycle to work. He said he got on his bike in the morning, biking gear, everything, got on his bike down his hallway, got off his bike, put on his work clothes. End of the day, same thing. Now, on the one hand, you could say that guy is, struggling. On the other hand, compared to what? He's trying to create some space between work and home and getting really, really creative in how he's going about it.
Yeah, and it goes viral. So I'm sure there's a benefit to that as well. I was also thinking, and by the way, you have these blurbs from people like Charles Duhigg, who, we both know, or Angela Duckworth. There's been some work on this. Obviously, Duhigg wrote Power of Habit. I think there's a lot of relation to what you're doing in relation to grit as well. This mindset that we bring to it, whether it's growth or otherwise. It was interesting to me to think about sometimes habits and rituals hold us back. Thinking about some types of very religious people from whatever community they might be and how they'll leave it and have this grand epiphany about all the things they weren't doing, from more extreme stuff like Scientology to even just more orthodox types of any type of religion. It made me reflect a lot when I was reading the book on this idea that sometimes these rituals hold us back. That sometimes some people would even argue that they're created as a way to control, or they weren't maybe created as a way to control. They were created as a way to perhaps shift the population in a certain direction to not do terrible or hedonistic things. But as we evolve over time, there is a sense of control in there as well.
I think one thing that's quite interesting to me is you do see people leaving their faith over time. You see some people who rejoin their faith later. You see some people who join a different faith. You see some people who decide it's not for them. Maybe they join Seattle Atheist Church or something like that. But it's the fact that sometimes people rejoin, or it isn't just that they leave faith, it's that they leave that faith and seek out a different faith. Again, I think speaks to this deep need that we have for things like this in our life. The form that they take can be very, very wide. I think we tend to think of rituals as a very narrow band of human behavior. For me, if I widen the scope, we're leaving behind only some aspects often, and still, again, trying to retain other aspects or seek them out elsewhere in order to get those things that religion gives us.
What do you hope the reader does at the end? That they're just acknowledging what they're doing day in and day out, that they take the idea of a ritual more seriously, because we've seen instances where successful people, be it in sports or business, have some type of ritualistic thing that they will point to and say, this is why I am. I think often about people like Howard Stern and transcendental meditation or whatever it might be. What do you want people to understand from this? That there's a danger that we need more rituals in our lives, that maybe we don't, like rituals maybe separate us too much. What are your thoughts?
The very first thing actually is, so advice like meditating for 6 hours a day is good for you. It's just not helpful. I'm sure it is. I mean, I don't know the research, but I'm sure that would be terrific, but we don't have it. So, the idea of saying you should add 19 rituals, we're just, it's not happening. You know what I mean?
It's like the Scarsdale diet of your brain.
Exactly. So I think the first thing for me always is actually to take an inventory of what you're doing now. And what we see is when people do that, and as you list, if you think about your morning routine, if you think about your routine with your romantic partner, your routine with your family and kids, all of them can either be boring or they can be filled with meaning and emotion and joy and be a little bit more ritualistic. I've seen that when people do this, they start to think, well, I don't have any rituals. And then in some domain, they say, oh yeah, I do over there. And then what happens is the next time they do it, it has a little bit more meaning to it, or almost you laugh to yourself a little bit, like, oh, here we go doing our thing. There's a couple that we had.
That's me in dressing in black, Mike. Like I wake up and I walk into my closet and I don't choose. I just know that I need underwear, pants, and a sweater. And then I'll reflect on it. Like I'll sometimes think it's my Mr. Rogers moment where I just putting on the sweater and doing my thing. Part of it, though, is definitely inside of me that I don't want to think about that when I wasn't doing this, I didn't like this mixing and matching. And then part of it is there's a bit of a brand thing. There's a bit of like how I just feel about myself there's all these things. And this is the thing that struck me most about your book is I really had a hard time looking at my day to day and thinking some of this feels very, very ritualistic and important to me. But it also feels very benign. Like, get over yourself a little bit. Like you're taking everything too seriously. It's just clothes.
Yeah. Although, again, I think if you think about having an interesting and rich and meaningful life, it's true that clothes can just be boring, or we can add a little bit more to them. They're never going to be the most meaningful thing in the world. Obviously, it's just clothes or just liquid in a cup or whatever it might be. But you do add a little bit of life to things, I think, with ritual. And I actually think, we have this line of research that shows that the diversity of the emotions we experience is important for our well-being, positive emotions and negative emotions, that it isn't just that if you're a perfect 10 happy all day, every day for your entire life, I'm sure that's a nice life, but afterward, you didn't go through anything. There weren't any ups and downs. There wasn't a range of things. And rituals a little bit can take us from I'm just doing the same thing every single day to as silly as it can be, your clothing ritual. It's just giving you a little extra something in the day that otherwise you wouldn't have.
And at what point Is it unhealthy when the ritual becomes a superstition? Like, where does superstition fit into this? I was thinking a lot about the athletes that you talk about in the book, and I spent a ton of time in the music business. I would watch certain musicians string their guitar a very
Oh yeah.
specific way, and I've seen a lot in my life. And I always wonder, what is this? Is it really this ritualistic deep connection to what you're trying to do, or is it pure superstition? Does that belittle it also?
I think of superstition as one category of rituals. So rituals can be, you know, a wedding and a funeral are rituals as well. A birthday cake is a ritual that don't they might be a little linked to superstition, but they're really kind of in the service of something else. Whereas knocking on wood is clearly a superstition in the service of. And what we tend to see is that superstition is often in the service of avoiding something bad. Rituals often are actually in the pursuit of something good. Not always, it doesn't break down perfectly like that, but you can think about, are you trying to just stay at baseline? And then what you're doing often is don't walk under the ladder. I don't want to have more bad luck than I already have. Or are you trying to enhance what's happening? You know, are you trying to make your morning ritual more meaningful, you know, and more emotional for yourself? So I think they're clearly related, and I do think superstition underlies some of the rituals that we engage in. But then there are other rituals that are quite common that don't seem to have the same exact element of warding off the bad.
And where does ceremony fit in this? Is ceremony just the box in which we keep the ritual?
Yeah, you can define ceremony. So I could, for example, observe your morning coffee thing and break it down into a series of steps and maybe like make a montage of it with emotional music or something. It might
Most
appear to
boring thing
be
ever, but yes,
but it
absolutely.
might appear to have meaning, and you know, it's ceremonial for you, I think, is the idea. So again, the word ritual, the word ceremony takes us to rituals with thousands of years of history, family, religion, but also we're very a birthday cake is quite a ceremony as well, even though it's silly
Yeah.
candles on a piece of food. So we do bring ceremony. In fact, I see it as a broader term where we can make things ceremonial in a way, in a nice way, even though they're not, you know, officially a ceremony that's written down somewhere.
I love how you belittle something so greatly, and then but you're okay with the fact that there's a ritual because it's not just food with candle in it.
Yeah, how boring, right? I mean, how
It's
boring. Well, if
interesting.
nothing happens on your birthday, you know, I mean, why do we celebrate our birthdays? Because we want to do something that isn't just like every single other day. By the way, my daughter is 8 years old, and I asked her. She asked questions about rituals. She's old enough sort of to understand, you know, what I'm always going on and on about and being
Is
bored
this a
by it.
job? Yeah. She's like,
Exactly.
Dad,
But
hurry up. Yeah.
but I said, well, you know why? She was asking about birthday cakes, and I said, well, why do you think we put candles on birthday cakes? Thinking, you know, it's this ritual is meaning or whatever. And she said, well, that's just so you know how old you are,
Oh,
which was a really
okay.
great.
+1, but yeah, okay.
Yeah.
But what about well, that's it. I mean, again, we're getting into real minutia here, but when you add a candle for luck and things like that, do you think about those weird add-ons that we do and why we do them? You talked a little bit, I think about it in the book where you're doing like group cheers at work. And I've been there. I've walked into a Target early in the morning and I'm like, okay, I could never work here. And I just make a be that stuff seems so fake and superstitious to like just superficial is what I'm
Yeah.
looking for.
Mm-hmm.
But yet you're documenting in the book how powerful it is for so many people. And again, that brings me to that whole, are we getting into a religion here? Is it a bit cultish where people are really into like, we got to get in and do that cheer before we, sell Tupperware?
It's a good example, actually, of looking down at a group of people who are all doing the same thing. And for some of them, they care about it and it's meaningful. And other people, it's filling them
Are
with hatred.
completely insane. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you a great story about that. I got a great one where a person I know started working for this company and they are tangentially related to the safety industry. And every Monday morning meeting, somebody has to present some safety tip as a way to start it off. And coming in as someone new, it was literally things like how to put on a seatbelt, how not to slip on ice.
Mm-hmm.
And they weren't sure. if this was a joke, like if employees were totally trolling the idea,
Right.
or if people were just really interested in the fact that they were so passionate about what they did. In hearing this story, I felt like this was some type of bastardization of what was meant, because some of the stuff was really ridiculous, like how to get out of a car safely or how to walk with an elderly. It sounded a bit weird to me, especially for adults. And it's exactly what you're saying now. It's illuminating my brain, where some people, you might be in the same thing and people are experiencing it in really polarized perspectives.
It for sure. I mean, if a manager, people often say the manager that they dislike the most is the manager who over the weekend watches like a TED talk or hears some podcast and comes in every Monday morning with a new magical thing. We're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And they, oh my God, and the eye roll. So for sure, I think that in the workplace, they can have these effects. Although I will say, when the manager comes in and says that and everyone eye rolls, they are eye rolling in unison. So they are actually bonding together with each other in the, it's not really what the manager was looking for, but there is this bonding element to it. But I do think if you think about these kinds of, team or group rituals, even the ones that are silly, I do think compared to what, so if you go on a corporate retreat and you have to do a trust fall, of course it's cheesy and ridiculous. I don't want to go either, just to be clear. But
no trust falls,
compared to never seeing your coworkers outside of work and never doing anything that involves trust, I think probably it's still on balance better for us to go through those kinds of activities than not to go through them. And even the safety example that you gave, if organizations say like our mission statement is about safety, and then it doesn't play out anywhere in the organization. In other words, there's no activities that reinforce that at all. And yet they say our culture is strongly about safety. How do you know? I mean, where does it come from?
So even the goofing on it, to a certain degree, what you're saying creates some connectivity and creates. I mean, here we are talking about this ridiculous example, and I think that validates that too.
In our lab group, which we call creatively, we call it Nerd Lab. One of the things we do, I mean, the value we, I think, hold higher than any other value is creativity, more than anything else. Also rigor and other scientific things, but creativity is really the value. And you can say, hey, we're a creative group. But again, what are the behaviors or rituals that you have in place that reinforce that over time for the people in the group and for the new people when they come in? One of the things we do is we call it Random Ideas Day. And you bring in an idea and you are not allowed to pursue it. You're not allowed to study it. If you study it, you've done something wrong. We even do things like pull Beatles songs out of a hat and come up with a research project based on the Beatles title. Can't Buy Me Love. How far
we've come in behavioral science?
Exactly.
Mike, are we at the end of the line here?
Exactly. And then again, you may not do the project, right? So the whole idea is this is idea generation. We'll do the other stuff sometimes on the ideas that maybe are better than the Beatles song titles, but that is and I wouldn't have thought of it as a ritual before I got into this, topic, but that's our way of saying this is actually the value that we're trying to embody. And even the silly safety one might be a little too far removed, but you can see that the goal was, let's make sure that everybody every day is thinking about how we value safety.
I feel like some people listening to this might think, is this a thing? Like, have we just spent an hour listening to Mitch and Mike talk about little things that we do to feel more connected, and how is this real? It's one thing to look and say, oh, Mike wanted to write a book and came up with this idea that rituals are the most important thing, but that's not the case. You're somebody who's an academic, Harvard Business School, MIT, you take this very seriously. And I guess even listening to us have this conversation, why? Like, why do we need to care so deep? Like, what was it that made you realize this is research worthy? This is as serious as behavioral economists looking at how we spend or why we do things. Why was this the thing? In a world where even having this conversation, it seems almost like they're platitudes that work well to help keep us synced. But, is there much more than this unless we get to a religious construct of it?
For me, what really was the hook is, so the way that the research unfolded was we started looking at rituals in one domain and then would talk to another smart person who would say, hey, have you ever looked at rituals in, and then they would say a noun. We would say, no, we haven't. Let's do that. And then another smart person would say, hey, have you ever looked at rituals in this domain? We'd say, no, family, close relationships, in consumer behavior, all of these sorts of different domains of life, in grief. everything in life started to be ritualistic. And for me, it's quite rare, actually. So you think of in different domains of life, we bring different solutions to bear. Rituals are one of the things that carry across all of these different situations in life. We turn to them so regularly, and just predictably, we're looking for them. We use them weddings and funerals. Very, very different goals, very, very different emotional palettes in each one, but we use rituals for them. We use rituals to amp ourselves up sometimes before a game. We use them to try to calm down when we're nervous. So if you think, if we made an emotion wheel or something, they are really involved in generating a huge range of emotions for us. And again, I think that in addition to the other things they can do, like connect us to people, connect us to our families and spouses, I think that alone actually is one of the reasons we have so many rituals, is because they allow us to experience these emotions. An emotion like awe, for example, is an incredible, incredible human emotion, or wonder. And they're really, really hard to get to. They're easy for kids, but for us, we're all jaded. We already seen everything. If you drive to the Grand Canyon, you will feel awe, but I don't have the time to drive there today. So, how do we generate this huge range and variety of emotions in our lives? And when you look and ask people, it's often rituals that are being brought to bear.
I'm going to assume, correct me if I'm wrong, that the furthest extreme might be something like a cult. Would that be the right way to look at this? Because people often think it's getting a little culty in here. We'll hear this a lot I think even specifically about pre-COVID when I would go to Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
And this was really before there was a big tech backlash. This was this was like going to Woodstock. You felt this movement of people. And then when you're on these campuses, they don't call them offices, they call them campuses. They evolved even from campuses pre-COVID, we forget, into these cities. They would even use these words specifically. People would have their dental work done there. They would forget the perks of massages and dry goods cleaning and whatever, but they would literally have dental work there. They would have all their meals there. Some of them had housing that was attached somehow to the organization. I even think about the fact that Google would, let's say, be busing people in these special buses that had Wi-Fi and all these amenities too.
Yeah.
That inside you might think, I'm 25 years old. I'm at the cutting edge of technology. I'm working for these cool companies. Everything's taken care of. I'm making a ton of money. I have stock options. But on the outside, people might look at this and say, you might want to take a beat. I don't know that you want to meet your spouse there and have babies in the Google pediatric ward or what. I'm being facetious here. And Google's awesome, great client of mine. But there's this interesting component of it where I believe deeply in the book, and I felt and saw myself in it and could point to instances that I felt kept me structured enough to get to the level of success as I define it. But at the same time, it wasn't hard to think just a heartbeat away from that being very cult-like.
I think
very unhealthy.
I think here's a random example. So I teach a freshman seminar at Harvard. These are 18-year-olds. It's in the fall. So it's the first time for many of them that they've been away from home for an extended period of time. And one of the things that I do with them is, and various holidays happen in the fall. One of them is Thanksgiving. So many of the students either are not from the US, or they're from the US, but they can't travel all the way home. They're from California or something. So they go home with a friend to their friend's house to celebrate this holiday. Okay?
Yeah.
Then afterward, I say, how'd it go? And they say, those people are crazy. And I say, why? And they say, well, they eat at 2:00 and that's just insane. And they don't have pie, they have cake, and they have ham in addition to turkey. I mean, they're really horrified by the whole thing. And it is as if you've entered a cult. These people are doing these activities that are just crazy, because of course the right way to do Thanksgiving is our way, the way I've always done it my entire life.
I thought there only was one way. Right.
That's what they say. They say, I didn't realize I cared about Thanksgiving until I saw it in a different way. And even, very trivial example, but even there, the feeling is that you've entered into some alternate universe of brainwashed people who believe that 2 p.m. is the right time to eat. We do see that that rituals often signal this is the way we do things around here. And sometimes that can be quirky and helpful, but as you said, sometimes that can be too far and controlling. Rituals, when they get related to rules, again, that's when they become not just something that we do, but they're prescriptive. then we're on a different kind of domain of rules and norms and regulations. I'm mostly interested in the rituals that are a bit self-generated or voluntary, but
Yeah, this is really interesting.
the other kind are the kind that are received are hugely fascinating and important in our lives as well. It was just
Yeah.
not exactly where I went. Many other amazing scholars have studied the received kind of rituals. I was interested in this. What are we all doing in our daily lives and in our families that we've never done before? We just came up with them.
But let's parse this, because this was one of the big ones for me, which was not just acknowledging and seeing it. You could look at things externally. What does Amazon do that's like this? Or what would Steve Jobs have done? And you bring up this very salient point. I want to highlight it, which is this idea that the ones that are best maintained come from below. It comes from the group that has decided to do this secret handshake or whatever it might be, versus we have this almost godlike leader. And we've seen them become real leaders, as in we look to them as guiding our future. Some successfully, some that get torn apart in the media, some that fail. The fail one that I was thinking more specifically about was WeWork.
Mm-hmm.
And again, not knowing Adam Newman or what's going on there, but thinking about all the media around it and the documentary. And it was almost like this Jesus-like figure. And if you didn't follow along with how they were apostatizing, like talking about things as if they were religious texts and believing in this, when ultimately it was simply a business that was buying buildings and leasing space, as you would say in the cake with food with candles in it.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I believe that most people that would think about the ritual effect without reading it would intuitively believe it is a top-down thing that we buy into, where the illuminating component of the book for me was the realization that no, it's actually the opposite. And if it's bottom up, how do you get the leaders to not ruin it?
Yes.
Because they will.
So, excuse me, when I give talks, one of the things I often start with is I'll have everybody stand up and I'll put up a slide.
Don't tell me you're doing trust falls.
It's close. It might be worse.
I
put up a slide that has a ritual on it. It says, clap once, stomp once, clap 3 times, stomp 3 times.
Oh, God.
At the end, it says, put your hand in the air and shout, let's go. Then it says, do it louder. And then they do it louder. And audiences will do it. I don't actually ask them to do it. I just put it up and you just do it because the guy's in the front of the room. And at the end of the ritual, they're almost always by the end in unison, shouting really loudly with their arms in the air, let's go. And I feel that if I ran out of the room, they would follow me. In other words, I feel as though
my hotel room,
exactly, wherever I say, off to Target, and they would all run to Target with me. So leaders do. I don't do anything with that, obviously, but leaders do use, of course, rituals to gather people together with a shared purpose to bring them toward a goal. The goal can be a good goal or a bad goal. That's up to the leader. But the top-down ones can be very, very powerful, just to say. But when we go into companies and ask employees about their team rituals, for example, they usually don't say trust fall corporate retreat. They talk about something that their team generated, to your point. Right. And those are the kind that really matter to people. And in fact, when we ask teams, do you have something like this or not? Teams that say they have a ritual like that could be just how they have lunch together every day. Very basic things, but they decided on it. They see their work as more meaningful than teams that just say, no, we don't have anything. We don't do anything like that.
I was also thinking about that story you were talking about, Thanksgiving and these freshmen. I think the world would be much more interesting if we were open to other rituals. You brought it out a little bit earlier. I was thinking about the first time I might have gone into a more religious synagogue or visited a church from a denomination that I didn't fully have any connection to, or even going to a Greek Orthodox church or an Italian event for Thanksgiving, whatever it might be. Tell me a little bit about what happens to us as individuals when we open ourselves up to other people's rituals. Is it we get cynical? Is it we realize how great we are? Does it make us better people is ultimately what I'm trying to understand.
One of my favorite examples, it happens anytime two people move in together, but let's say, when they get married, there's many conflicts that can arise.
Oh, yeah.
As we know.
The toothbrush. Yeah.
Completely.
Sink for sure.
But some of the conflicts are about the daily rituals, and some, of course, are about the big rituals, the religious rituals, the cultural traditions,
Yeah.
and you've got to sort it. And the way that it gets sorted is I have mine and you have yours, and mine are right and yours are wrong, but we're both feeling that way.
Yeah.
What couples end up doing typically is they take some from me, some from you, and come up
Some
with
from the
some of their
world.
own.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's very, very common in these. You can see in blended families too, for example, when you have each person has
Right.
children from a previous marriage, and now it's the Brady Bunch, but the real version where it's hard
Right.
to do that.
Right.
Children say, it was very important that we kept some of the elements of how we did Christmas from my old family, because then that made me feel like I'm still connected to that as well.
Yeah.
And then you'll see blended families come up with their own new ones also. So this idea, it's almost like we're from the world. I like that phrase. We're searching around. We got a little bias toward our own for sure, but we don't always absolutely have to stick to our own. We do pull from other things, and we do come up with new things on our own all the time. And I do think there's something about that pastiche that is really lovely when we can get that right.
Mike, walk me through science, the whole scope of science, everything we know about science. Now, I'm curious about this because you'll see this on books. It's a marketing trope, cutting edge science, the latest science research. You really did do research and science around this. I want you to thread the needle for people who might be eye rolling really hard and thinking about, come on, we're doing science and research on rituals and what does that mean from a serious academic standpoint? You have to have something there. How do you dig for this? How do we know it's not emotional? Well, today I'm feeling this way, so that's what I say, versus it actually being science based. Because again, my greater problem is we're not agreeing with science on anything, but science is arbitrary, biology is arbitrary. We're just throwing anything out these days. And my concern in the work that I do here is that we take science seriously, and that we can laugh about all these quirky, weird things that we do at work or with our families or with religion, but ultimately you were backing science into this. Why, and what does that mean? How do we know it's real, that this is truth?
I will say some of the most fascinating research on rituals we just can't do. So, for example, it would be amazing to randomly assign people to different religions and do an experiment and
You're
leave
on
them
circumcision, Mike.
exactly,
Yeah.
and leave them there for 40 years, and then come back and figure out. We're always looking for the causal effect of anything that we try in science. That really is the gold standard. But some of the things we do, we can't randomly assign you to a marriage, right. Things like that. So in those cases, what we do is we use surveys. We'll ask people, what do you do? And then we try to see if it correlates with some outcome measure, like teams at work. We ask them, do you have these practices? And then we ask them, is your work meaningful to you? It's correlational though, right? So we don't know where the causal arrow is. But in some cases, we do actually try to do the causal arrow when we can. So for example, with this silly ritual that I just described with the hand clapping and stomping and shouting, we've used a ritual like that in lab experiments where we'll take random groups of people and have them either do something like that that's ritualistic or something like that that's less ritualistic, all randomly assigned. They don't know each other. Only difference is this. And we see there that the teams that do this ritualistically see it as more meaningful. And they translate that a little bit onto the work that they do. They come to see the work that they do after that as more meaningful. Now, not meaningful in the way that we would have meaning in a job that we've been in for 30 years, right? So we're looking at the barest minimum intervention to see if we can see these effects causally. So when we can, we always try to do the experiments to show that it isn't just that people say, yeah, I do this and I do that, whatever, I don't care about it, but that we can actually create some of these emotions in people. Even if they say, I'm not really a ritual person, we can sometimes still show that, well, yeah, you are, because if we have you engage in some behaviors like this, they do change how you think and feel.
So what would be that cutting edge science, if we were going to really validate that as a statement for this book, that was done for this book, that you felt there's a breakthrough here? This is different than something we might have seen Charles Duhigg say, or because usually when it comes to especially business books, which I love, I'll often say to people, the reason you should write a book about habits or rituals is because even though there are other books on the topic, it's because no one's heard your take on it. But when we move into science, it's a different perspective. You're almost acting like a scientist or journalist reporting Can you nail down, even one big one where you thought this is something, this is what takes it to the next?
There's a huge movement in marketing toward ritual over the last, especially 5 years, but over it's been a trend that's been building. And in fact, if you Google ritual and brand or something like that, you're going to get.
And this makes perfect sense, because we went from brands telling us myths to this idea in the early 2000s, which I was definitely a part and pusher of, this idea that brands can build community. The natural evolution of community brings us exactly to this moment in time, for sure.
For sure. And I think there's a non-alcoholic beverage company called Ritual. There's skincare products that are called Ritual.
Right. Yeah,
just literally called Ritual, not even anything else, just Ritual. You see it all over there's a store, a chain of stores that's called Ritual as well.
Yeah, for sure.
So this word, marketers have figured out, has emotional resonance for people. And then also they're trying to build in ritualistic behavior into the consumption of products. One of my favorite examples, so if you think of skincare products over time, these numbers are not correct, but for a while humans had no soap. Let's say thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. Then they had soap, and you use soap everywhere. And then at some point after that, people were like, well, you know what? Hair is different from the body. We need two soaps. And then after that, they were like, well, wait a minute.
Hair is different from face hair.
Exactly. And my hands are different from my feet are different. So you see this incredible exponential growth in the number of soaps or products that we have. Happened first for women, and now men are actually catching up at a lag.
Absolutely.
But what are we doing there? We're actually saying, let's see if we can add one more step in the morning. Can we get away with adding one more step without people saying they don't have time, in order to have some different product that we can also sell? I'm being very cynical right now, but if you just look at the trend over time, and there is a case where when you think more deeply and carefully about ritual, you can in fact create different experiences for customers. Not only are they more interested, but getting them in this habit actually of practicing it in the way that you want moves it from just, I just put this stuff on my face, to people say, I have my morning thing that for you it's coffee, but I need to do all of these steps in order to get there.
But this is interesting, because we're trying to back this into the actual science of it. And it sounds like, if I was listening to this, I always say that as a marketing professional, I love this stuff. And then when I sold my agency, I became a customer advocate. And you're like, oh, shame on you for doing all this stuff that you did. Yeah. This is natural progression of any marketing professional. What's interesting about it, it feels more like we're using marketing and messaging to play on your emotions to create this false thing. I don't necessarily feel like that's a positive use of the science. So one is, I'm trying to see from you that's fine. You might say, that's how research works, Mitch. I'm not trying to put a positive spin on this. Is actually a really negative thing that's created these rituals. Walk me through that. Is that what you're saying? That it's okay that it's a negative one, or it was created in a manipulative way?
So I think that, if you think of something like, I am an academic, so I tend to be agnostic in terms of company. We discover things, and then the world can use them for ill
as they wish,
or good. For whatever reason, academics don't keep our own IP, which is an insane. We could talk about that for 5 hours, but we give it, and then companies do whatever. But if you think of something, but
marketers will weaponize it no matter what.
Somebody will.
We do, yeah.
Somebody will. But if you think of something like Valentine's Day, for example, which people have very strong emotions about, including me and including you, I'm sure, they made this stuff up, and now we got to buy these roses and all this kind of stuff. On the one hand, it's true that that's like a very cynical thing that got added to our lives. On the other hand, when you get married, and you may be married, there's a day, we call it a wedding. And then after the wedding, you're with that person for 100 more years. And so the question is, how do you keep showing that person that you're in it and that you're committed? And you can do it every day if you feel like it. And we see couples who find things that they do every day. They kiss 3 times before they fall asleep. They have these little rituals. But Valentine's Day, for all its commercialization and all the things that people don't like about it, at least there's one day a year where we have to do something nice for our spouse. You know what I mean? It's actually a culturally nice thing that we do to help couples just one time go out for dinner together and make sure they go out for dinner together. Right. So there is the cynicism of, you should spend a lot of money. You need to get roses. That stuff is for me, gets the cynicism going.
Right.
But the idea that as a culture, we said, hey, value your spouse
crazy.
one
Yeah.
night, literally one night a year. Can you just take them out for a nice dinner?
Yeah. Yeah. But there's also the other component of it. We mentioned it in this conversation. I think about it a lot as one of the ones that might be the healthiest and most interesting to talk about is the breaking of bread. So interesting how that one transcends everything. Can we name anything from the worst of cults to the nicest of gatherings? Even you and I having this conversation, my reaction before was we have to break bread in some way, shape, or form. So you're having your Diet Coke, I'm having my coffee, but that lubricates the conversation and the connection. It definitely does. Versus us both sitting here thinking, I wish I had my coffee, or I wish I was able to, grab that bottle of water. What is it about breaking bread that is so universal? Because that's the only one I could think of that transcends every XY axis of anything related to ritual that you might discuss.
When you meet somebody and you're getting along and you want to see them again, you don't say, hey, we should find time to sit at a table across from each other.
Right.
That'd be a weird thing to say.
True, yeah.
Say, we should get a coffee. We should get a drink. We should get a... So they actually do. They offer us an excuse in order to get together, that we use these kinds of rituals. In most cultures, coffee or tea is quite common. It varies exactly what's done with coffee and tea, but many cultures have something, in the Japanese tea ceremony, for example.
Absolutely.
We do, in fact, use these rituals with food in particular as a way to connect with other people and as an excuse to gather with other people as well.
But food and breaking bread even transcends that, because even when we get through the hurdle of the initial, we use it when someone dies, we then break bread to commune.
Yep.
Why?
So
why is that the one? Have you looked into this? I'm so, because as I was reading the book, I was like, oh, the one was breaking bread. I couldn't think of a situation where even in the form of trying to broker peace, it's got to be around some type of good baked good. Like we're not going to solve world chaos without having a muffin between us.
Right. Let's at least have a full stomach. So Ayelet Fishbach has this research on commensality.
She's been on this show. She's
amazing.
Great.
One of my favorite researchers ever.
I love her.
And one of her many fascinating papers, she literally shows that eating off a shared plate
huge
makes you feel more connected to each other than eating on same food, etc., off of separate plates. So there is something deeply in us about the idea of sharing food, sharing a resource, as though you are a family member. I mean, in a sense, what we're doing is we're taking things that are deep in us. Who do we share plates with? Our kids, our spouse, that. And we use it in order to create these emotions as well. In this case, it's a nice thing because we can connect with other people. But it really does show. I mean, I love that study because it's so, and I mean simple as a huge compliment. Yeah. It's elegant, just to show that even these small little actions, when they have all of this meaning associated with them, can really change the way we think and feel about ourselves and about other people.
So number 2 on my list, we're going to go through the top 10, Mike, together, you and I. But number 2 on the list would be the diamond ring. And I say this because we were just talking about marriage and how that comes together. But my cousin, who's also a close friend of mine, is now the head of people at Lego, EVP there. But one of his jobs was De Beers marketing, bringing the engagement ring to Asia, where it traditionally wasn't a thing. And now it would seem like it was always there. This is another interesting one, a marketing one, that is a part of our DNA, as if you're not really even going to be a union together, that wasn't involved in it. It's really interesting how breaking bread, it seems more biological that we would do that, but something like giving a ring to demonstrate love or commitment is literally the best marketing strategy that was ever created. But it speaks so specifically to it being only a ritual. I mean, it really is one of the ones where you could look at it and go, there's just only a ritualistic component to it.
One of my favorite things about the wedding rings is that we have a finger.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That is called the ring finger.
Yeah,
we literally, the only thing we think of for this finger, it's crazy. The other fingers with pink, this is a pinky. The other ones, we got all these names.
Yeah.
And it is the most useless finger. So you can see why humans,
the middle finger.
They were like, let's use that one. There you go. So for sure, I mean, this idea of naming a finger after it shows you just how important these rings can be. I mean, I will say, functionally speaking, wearing a ring on your ring finger shows other people
Right.
that you are
But
off
again,
the market.
it was a marketing business strategy that ties into this almost like, who can I breed with? Like, we don't parse it and realize that, as you're saying, as some type of social signal, you're proclaiming it in the same way you would say, like, oh, there's like a pack of hyenas, and when we know they're in heat, this is what happens. We're like, yeah, humans do that because we have a ring on our finger, as if that's normal.
Right, exactly.
There's nothing normal about that.
Completely. And it could be a ring on our toe. It could be, I mean, you can think of the wide range of things it could be. At some point, some cultures decided, no, actually the best thing is to put a round thing on one of your fingers.
In getting ready for this conversation, I would be remiss, and I'm going to be respectful of your time, that we didn't talk about the IKEA effect. Again, as a marketing person, I've loved the concept of it. We haven't really gone deep on this, but Dan Ariely and I have had a long-standing, awesome relationship. He introduced me to my literary agent, which is his literary agent. So
Great.
he's like my grandfather of the work that I do. But the IKEA effect is something that you named and came up with. And for those who don't know, one is just introduce the concept, and two, talk to me what that's like. I think that anybody who thinks for a living or is in this world of thought leadership, that to me is the apex predator, being in a place where like we have an effect, and then Mike, it's yours. I'm friends with Henry Mintzberg. So the idea of like Mintzberg on management is so cool. Like I know the guy,
Yeah.
Talk about the IKEA effect. I'm so curious about how, and then also I'm curious, how does it transcend into being such a known part of our business thinking?
The initial idea for that project came from noticing that many people have very unattractive things that they've built. many people, or painted. Or painted. There's a terrible painting that somebody has made. And every time they move, they make sure to take it with them. And their spouse keeps trying to say, can we put that in the guest bedroom instead of the,
we're going to transport that with security. Yeah,
exactly.
Sure.
And so the question is why? Because we usually don't say it is amazing. Like, we're aware in some sense we're not that gifted, most of us, but it has a lot of meaning and value to it. And the question was why? What is it about making things ourselves that really can imbue them with more value? We called it, regrettably, in some ways, in other ways it's fine, the IKEA effect, is because you build your own furniture.
No, it's a huge thing. It's like you buy this $70 thing that you've built, and suddenly you have to move this piece of crap. And by the way, if you took it apart, it's not happening.
Nothing. No, it's just totally useless. And by the way, it's not that you think that your bookcase that you put together yourself is the best one in the world. It's just that if you put one together and it looks not good, and I put one together and it looks not good, both of us are going to keep our not good one. So it isn't necessarily that we think they're great. It's just, it's mine. I made it. And we do see that across many, many domains, that we have this thing in us where if we put a little effort into things, not too much, because then, we get frustrated, but a little effort into things, we do imbue them with more value. That actually linked to the research on rituals, because of this idea that people are coming up with their own rituals. They're crafting them, not in exactly the same way as an IKEA product, but we're crafting them by ourselves. We're crafting them in groups. And then again, that can imbue them with a different kind of meaning than if the bookcase is already put together. It's perfectly put together. It's beautiful. That's great, but it's not really part of me.
And by the way, I think that the best tech firms have done this in a brilliant way. My favorite example would be the Apple Spotify thing. Like, the reason I'm not on Spotify is I just started building playlists earlier on Apple. So I'm never going to abandon it because I have playlists. Or even now I think about ChatGPT. Like, yes, I'm trying Claude and the other ones, but because I've started building individual bots within it, that allows me, when I load it, I'm looking, it's personal. It's like, these are the things I have built.
Yes.
It's such a powerful business model.
And you wouldn't like looking at the same songs, looking at them in a different interface now for you would be,
Yeah, exactly. If I just imported it, it wouldn't feel the same as had I built it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the second part of that would be, what's it like when you start seeing this being deployed as a business model and people pointing to it as this is where we need to go to build loyalty, to build brand, to build ritual?
I think that I actually
without being able to own your IP on this, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. I was a marketing professor for many years, and then I moved actually to a different group. My midlife crisis was I moved academic groups, 6 feet from each other, but leaving that aside.
Wild guy, yeah.
But in marketing, I think, the cynical view of marketing is that marketers trick people. into believing things that kind of aren't true. And there's certainly cases of that, just to be very clear. The positive view of marketing is that marketers create experiences and they promise you that if you come along with us, we will give you this experience, and then they deliver on it.
Right.
That also for some people still feels, I don't like the idea of designing things. So we could probably talk about that for a very long time.
Sure.
What are the ethics of these things? But I do think something where when you deliver on the promise, then I say I'm much more comfortable with that than when you make me a promise that you can't even deliver on. So a company like Disney, I mean, my daughter's 8 years old. A company like Disney makes a huge promise. I mean, they literally say it is magical. Now that is extremely difficult to fulfill. You know, if we're making boxes, it's very hard to, say this is going to be magical.
Well,
right?
It's even harder to fulfill when you think of like when they started, it was probably easier. Like you'd go to Niagara Falls and be impressed. Now you go to Niagara Falls and you're like, it's like a lot of water.
Exactly.
I've seen a lot.
I've seen water. Yeah. But I do think, I mean, not to endorse any company, but when you bring little kids to Disney, they think it is magic.
Right.
And so is Disney tricking kids, or are they creating these amazing reasonable people can disagree, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah. So tell me the one thing that made you think differently.
I read this book years ago now. It's called A Pattern Language. And it's a group of designers that they're these very brief chapters, like 2-page chapters that are just, I shouldn't say just, not in a pejorative way. They're small observations about the physical world and how they shape how we think and feel. And I mean, I'm a social scientist. My whole job is thinking how people think and feel and what their behavior is. And this completely blew my mind of designing the environment in these very subtle ways. Because we usually come up with interventions that they're not design, it's a different level. But I remember one of the ones in the book was if you are in a room with a roof, with a ceiling, if it's a very long room with a low ceiling, you feel claustrophobic. If you put another wall in the middle of the room so that the rooms are smaller, you feel less claustrophobic.
Wow.
And think about the experience of it. When you're in the long thing, it feels like, oh my God. And then if it's a regular room, oh, this is fine.
It's a nice small room.
Right? So, I mean, that's one of hundreds literally in this book. But this idea of looking at the environment in that way it actually reshaped how I do my own science, but also just reshaped literally how I stare at the world.
Yeah, tag on to that would be the work that Rob Walker's doing with The Art of Noticing. Very similar stuff. Yes. It's very compelling when you see his newsletter and his book. He's been on the show. He's great. He's amazing. New book is called The Ritual Effect. You have another great book called Happy Money. Also, we'd be remiss to not let people know to check out the TEDx talk. That 5 million views is supremely impressive. Mike, let people know where they can find out more about your work. I know you post a lot on LinkedIn. Where can people find out more papers, writing, all the stuff you're doing?
Easiest place is michaelnorton.com, and most of what's on there is boring, but there's a link that says quiz, and we've developed a rituals quiz that you can take. It's across domains of life. You can kind of see where you're doing them and where you're not. It's fun actually to do it with your spouse and then compare your results and kind of learn a little bit about each other. So if you go to the website, that's one of the fun places to go to engage a little more with these ideas.
Yeah, I did it a few days ago, and I was surprised by how I was very polarized. I was clicking all the way left, all the way right, and thinking, that's strange. This is a strange experience. Mike, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Mitch. This was great.